All right, so let's discuss progressivism. Uh, Now, this is one of the major movements in American history, one of the major reform movements. Um, I'll talk a little bit later about what it laid the groundwork for, because it really changed the way government was practiced in the United States. This movement changed quite a bit. Now, last week, I posted a lecture on laissez-faire and the general welfare state. And I know this was in the first chapter that we read this term. And the issues associated with labor and industry, as well as the changing landscape of America, helped to lay the groundwork for progressivism. Now, again, we've talked about laissez-faire and the general welfare state. Now, the general welfare state is what progressivism ultimately entails. That is kind of that is the general welfare state coming to fruition as progressivism. Now, some of the problems that progressives were trying to rectify: child labor, the length of the workday, Americanization of immigrants, housing, different things. But again, the three major catalysts of change are the three major catalysts for progressivism: urbanization, immigration, and industrialization, and how these three tie up together. Now, progressivism did not simply spring up overnight. Again, we've discussed laissez-faire, the general welfare state, and the latter were those who espoused, again, this kind of the foundation of progressivism. To reiterate, we had the social gospel movement, preachers who sought to ameliorate the conditions of the working class in the cities. We also have authors who make claims. Henry George wrote Progress and Poverty in 1879, claiming that land ownership was the problem for the inequalities of wealth. He suggested profits from land sales be taxed at 100%. Wow. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward attempted to look into the future to find the hardships of the Gilded Age had been rectified by an activist, utopian, socialist government. So again, here is a fiction writer, Edward Bellamy, literally writing that the only way to get past these problems was an active government, a socialist government. Thorstein Veblen's theory of the leisure class discussed the ostentatious displays of wealth by the rich, creating the term conspicuous consumption along the way. His concern: maybe all the money that we spend on European art and fancy clothing could be better spent. Now, for anybody that is kind of interested in social commentary, especially around the turn of the 19th century or the turn into the 20th century, Thorstein Veblen, Theory of the Leisure Class. Buy it, read it, you'll love it. It's funny. We also have, again, pragmatism. We've discussed William James, John Dewey, their scientific methods towards initiating social change. And again, they argued that an activist government could help cure society's ills. And of course, as I mentioned last week, we have populism. Populism very much laid the groundwork for progressivism. But as populists focused on the problems of rural America, progressives focused on the problems associated with the three big changes of the time that I mentioned: urbanization, immigration, and industrialization. Now, laissez-faire had facilitated the growth of business in the cities without restrictions or regulation, and new problems arose. Progressives would attempt to fix these issues in a variety of ways. Now, they were realistic, but they were also optimistic and believed in inevitable progress. They wanted to reform the excesses of the new industrial and urban society, and they wanted to use the educated elite to do so. They focused on expertise in management and would apply scientific methods and pragmatism to the problems of the nation. Now, the three big methods: investigate, educate, legislate. So again, the goal: investigate the problems, educate people on them, and then legislate to formulate change. Now, this gets to one of the major legacies of progressivism, and that is the use of the government to help eradicate social and economic ills. They would have supported the general welfare state side of the argument that we discussed. For them, regulation was essential, and the government needed to be involved. It is also important to note that there was no one definitive progressivism. Rather, it was made up of many different strands. Some progressives called for reform, others called for outright structural change. I mentioned Bellamy socialism earlier. Many sought the use of government to effect change, but there was also a movement called voluntarism, as promoted by reformer Frederick Howe. Now, these folks wanted the people to make change and eschew any kind of government involvement. This was not necessarily laissez-faire thought or conservatism in action. Rather, it was the belief that people must create change to make it true and lasting. That is a pretty interesting theory, and I would say a pretty effective, and correct theory, because if the people are not involved in the change, what good is the change? Now, one major facet of progressivism, women. Women were at the forefront of the progressive movement. They sought larger change to improve the lives of all and garner a more inclusive society with basic standards of living. Now, men often led the charge for limited reform, as expressed in America Reform by Maureen Flanagan. But this was not simply about suffrage and prohibition. They were key to each part of the progressive movement and the reform efforts. And that is something important to remember, because later in the term, when we discuss the civil rights movement, when we discuss the student left and the student movement, women were also key in those movements. And this is no coincidence. It's also no coincidence that women were key to the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War, and made major change after the Civil War. So women have been key to every kind of reform movement really throughout American history. Women have not just been on the sidelines, women have been active. Now I want to discuss the four major objectives of progressivism now. First, the four listed are Americanization, democratization, humanization, and rationalization. Now first, Americanization. One of the fears associated with immigration was that we would become a nation of foreigners, that these foreigners would retain their language, values, and traditions of their homelands, thereby negating any type of American culture and leading to fracture among ethnic lines. Progressives wanted to break these ties and reorient these immigrants toward American ways and values. They sought simply to Americanize them. Now, how did they do this? First, compulsory schooling. Compulsory schooling sounds great. Hey, every kid needs to go to school. Part of this, though, is Americanization. This way, immigrant children learned English, but they also, importantly, got out of their ethnic neighborhoods and into an environment where American values dominated. This would also address the issue of child labor, which was a major issue that had blighted American society for decades and which was a key issue of progressives. By 1918, every state in the Union required school attendance. Age requirements did vary, but again, by 1918, every state in the Union required school attendance. It's a good thing. It's also a way to control people. Number two, a second way that we Americanized were settlement houses. Middle-class American women moved into the urban slums and established settlement houses. Now, these settlement houses provided basic services to the poor, such as medical care and education. And they also sought to help them with everyday problems. These settlement houses sprung up in most American cities. The most popular example would be Jane Addams and Hull House on Chicago's West Side. Jane Addams, a leading reformer and again one of the faces of the progressive movement. Now there was significant impact in many ways by these settlement houses. First, they provided firsthand experience of the problems plaguing American cities, and they led to lobbying for reform. So we've got investigate and legislate right there. Arguably more important, again, women led this movement, and this was the only area in which women were active in the public arena. Remember, they don't have the right to vote yet. So how do they do this? They initiate and lead these reform movements. Now, within this, we also have the suffrage movement. We have prohibition. So these are two of the key movements within progressivism that are led by women. Now, women were limited to a few professions, but again, this allowed college-educated women to be active in the public sector, because women are going to college as well. Not in the numbers that we would see, say, beginning in the 1960s, but there are college-educated women, and they want to be productive and help society, and this is one way that they can do that. Now, a third factor in Americanization, because I had those two right there, just kind of, again, getting to how these settlement houses worked on Americanization. The third factor, or the third example, would be prohibition. Now, make no mistake, prohibition was not solely about morality. Surely this was part of it, as alcohol led to disruptions of family, employment, etc. But remember that these new immigrants came from different parts of the globe. They practiced different cultural traditions. One of these was the consumption of alcohol. And for many reformers, the attempt to apply prohibition was about social control of these different people. Now, a second way that they made change was democratization, or a second goal was democratization. Again, the goal to be democratize the political system, make city government more professional and less corrupt. One example of this was what was called gas and water socialism. Progressives sought to eliminate the system of corrupt contracts between urban political machines and utility companies. Now, there had been issues. Outbreaks of cholera and similar diseases had directly impacted many, and the search for clean and safe water would ameliorate these issues. They also sought to supply gas and electricity to all city residents. They believed the cities should own and operate utilities for the benefit of everyone, not simply for profit. Seems like a pretty good idea, right? Number two, keeping in line with the focus on expertise, they also sought to establish commission systems where the experts or where commissions of experts would run a city rather than elected mayors or city councils. The thought was that experts would manage the city more efficiently and would not be enslaved by political machines. Now, does this truly sound democratic, though? This sounds rather self-serving. Again, instead of allowing people to elect leaders of the city, they would just establish these commissions of experts. And this gets to some of the critical analyses of progressivism, because a lot of people just consider the progressives, oh, they were this great reformers, they made all this good change, they were so righteous, they were so superior. Many would argue otherwise. One of the key scholars of progressivism, and make no mistake, progressivism after the Civil War is the most studied part of American history by American historians. But again, getting back, Richard Hofstadter, one of the key historians of progressivism and a liberal, argued that progressivism was about middle-class people trying to retain their status in society. Another significant critical analysis of progressivism came from Gabriel Kolko in his Triumph of Conservatism. Yes, you heard that right. He wrote a book about progressivism called Triumph of Conservatism, because his take on progressives was that these people were not seeking to truly change or reform society, but rather they sought self-preservation, control, and self-promotion, that this supposed democratization was just rhetoric, that these people, that the people themselves were not behind the movement, and this is where he breaks off from Hofstadter. Hofstadter again argues that the middle class is behind this. Kolko says it wasn't even the middle class who were behind this. It was about corporate leaders who simply sought to regulate business in an attempt to maintain their power in the status quo. So again, this shows Kolko is one of these people who's critical of progressivism. And he argues that it wasn't about making change to help people. It was about maintaining the status quo. It was about control. It was about the power of the wealthy. Interesting analysis. Now, a third way that progressives tried to democratize was at-large voting and the direct primary. Now, rather than be restricted to your neighborhood, one could vote for any city council position in the city. This obviously limited the power of an ethnic neighborhood to elect a representative of their own. Those in distant areas held equal votes, reducing the power of these local voters. Direct primary allowed party members to elect candidates rather than the machines or the party leadership. So direct primary is definitely one way that we see some more democratization. But again, this idea that these open elections, if you have an ethnic neighborhood and you want to elect somebody who is from your ethnic group because they understand your traditions, that's a somewhat limited opportunity now because anyone can vote. So again, it's not always about spreading the wealth, and this again is a way that they kind of minimize what we today would call multiculturalism, and this is where we get the idea of the melting pot, where we bring everybody in and make them American rather than allow them to practice their own cultural traditions. And that is one significant difference between, say, 1900, when you have the melting pot, and 2017, when we practice true multiculturalism. The fourth way that they democratized: initiative, referendum, recall, the direct election of senators. Fifth way, suffrage. Women's suffrage movement was an important part of progressive politics. It was led by women, but men participated too. Now, it's hard to believe that less than 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. It came in 1920, and I think it would be kind of interesting if on the 100-year anniversary of women getting the right to vote, a woman was elected president. But that's for a few years down the road. Now, the origins of the women's movement and the abolitionist movement, which I had mentioned earlier, later women would be central to the civil rights movement as well as the student left. Experience in these organizations would help foster a return of a stronger women's movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, we're a few weeks away from that. But again, to reiterate, even before what we have talked about this term, in 1848 is when the women's movement in the United States really kicks off at the Seneca Falls Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton would write the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, the Seneca Falls Declaration, and this would help to guide the women's rights movement, particularly the suffrage movement. Now, women, again, I had mentioned, also led the Prohibition movement, the WCTU, for example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, not a union as one might think. It was formed in 1874. And the early focus was due to the impact of alcohol on women and children, as well as its impact on poverty and other social issues. The WCTU became a force in politics, even though women still did not have the right to vote. Now, the suffrage movement itself was led by a few important organizations. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Susan B. Anthony as its first president, and later the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul. The latter became more activist, picketing important events, chaining themselves to public buildings, engaging in hunger strikes, and accepting arrest for their actions. These organizations were helped by the fact women were more active in public life in general. Again, now they are enjoying post-secondary education, they are professionals, they are in medical and law school, etc. But there was some opposition to suffrage. Upper-class women, for example, many felt that the woman's place was indeed in the home, that raising a family was more important than the vote or politics, and that their husbands represented them just fine. Business leaders also, because women led many reform efforts, businessmen often wanted them marginalized to avoid more regulation, to avoid these reform efforts. If they voted, it would be even worse, right? But we know eventually, again, women did earn the right to vote in 1920. Okay, so let's get back to this. A third way of rendering change: rationalization. Progressives wanted to rationalize society. They wanted to make it more orderly and efficient. Included in this was harmonizing big business with traditional American values and to force them to behave ethically. Along these lines, they wanted to foster cooperation between labor and business. One reason for this: they feared that if business and government worked together, workers and unions may become even more radicalized and demands would escalate. They might return to radical organizations like the IWW rather than conservative organizations like the AFL. Now, the creation of the Department of Labor in 1884 would help with this. It researched labor issues and statistics to become a voice for labor and the working poor. But again, this gets back to this idea of how democratic were the progressives, because the effort here again is about minimizing change. They don't want workers to become radicalized. They want them to remain somewhat conservative. They want workers and business to work together. Now, again, this is great as an ideal, but it does not necessarily represent true democratization. Again, it represents more of a taming down of any kind of radicalism. A fourth way: humanization. So we have democratization, Americanization, rationalization, and humanization. They sought to humanize industrial capitalism. Now, there were growing issues regarding contaminated food, defective and dangerous products, fraudulent advertising. Remember the power of laissez-faire and the desire for limited or no regulation. And that was causing some of these problems. Now, the National Consumers League was formed in 1898. It tested and certified products as safe. Other organizations would also test products for safety. But there were still many industries that just lacked important regulation. And one example of this would be meatpacking. Now, some of you may turn into vegetarians after you hear this story. There were four large corporations that owned the meatpacking business, and they centralized operations in a few major cities. Chicago was one. Folks lived in Packingtown. This is one of the towns outside of Chicago where these meatpackers lived. For the most part, these were unskilled immigrants. Many were from Poland, Slovakia, Lithuania. They lived in tenement apartments. They rented rooms next to the stockyards and city dumps. They did most of the dangerous work. They worked in the dark, in unventilated rooms. Many stood all day on floors covered with blood, meat scraps, and foul water. Women and children over 14 worked at meat trimming, sausage making, and canning. Now, most workers in these meatpacking plants made pennies per hour. A few skilled workers earned as much as 50 cents an hour as pace setters. Now, pace setters were those who sped up the assembly line and made sure all workers were working as fast and efficiently as they could. So these were kind of the supervisors. These were the people that, let's face it, nobody on the floor liked. Now, when we talk about making a few pennies an hour, that seems ridiculous. But again, things cost a lot less back at the beginning of the 20th century. Still, though, this is a below poverty wage for these workers. Now, there was an author named Upton Sinclair, and he wanted to expose this. Now, Sinclair was a socialist author at the time. He would later write the book Oil, which would be made into a movie called There Will Be Blood. Maybe you're familiar with that. Sinclair, again, a socialist author, he wrote a book called The Jungle. Now, The Jungle, he hoped, would show some of the problems associated with the food industry. He went undercover to work at a meatpacking plant after a 1904 meatpacking strike was brutally put down. He wrote of working in the meatpacking plant and described the horrors of working there. Included in this were tales of the horror, and due to the laissez-faire mentality of businessmen and government representatives, nothing was being done. There was no regulation. And that's what he was writing about. Now, what were some of these horrors? Men in the pickling room had skin disease, and they were touching the meat, pickling it. Men who used knives on the assembly line, on the sped-up assembly lines, often lost fingers. Sometimes these fingers would not be recovered. Workers with tuberculosis were coughing and spitting up blood as they worked on the floor, as they were working with the meat that was being packed. Workers were using primitive toilets next to where the meat was being processed. They used no soap or water to clean their hands, and at times workers were even urinating in the corners. Again, they are using toilets right next to the assembly line, right next to the meat packing line, and they're not even using soap and water to clean up. There was diseased, rotten, and contaminated meat products being processed. They were doctored by chemicals. They were labeled for sale to the public. Dead, injured, and diseased animals were processed after regular hours with no inspectors around. Meat for canning and sausage piled on the floor and piled up into carts with sawdust, human spit and urine, rat dung, poison, and even dead rats. So people who were eating sausage or canned meat from these places often had that included in there. There are also the stories of men falling into the steaming lard vats. So men working on these vats would fall into the steaming lard. The quote from the book, "When they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard." Now, Durham was a fictional plant, but chances are what Sinclair was talking about was armor meats. So again, not only do you have potential dead animals, feces, urine, they're actually human body parts in these vats of lard. So again, you can imagine this was quite revolutionary at the time, quite disturbing. The reaction, the book sold like crazy. It made Sinclair quite wealthy, but he was disappointed. Now, Sinclair was an accidental muckraker. His goal was to show the awful conditions of working people in the meatpacking plant, that something should be done, and that this something was socialism. He did not want reform. He did not want evolutionary change. He wanted revolutionary change. And in perfect socialist fashion, when people called for reform, again, he wanted revolution. His famous quote, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." So Sinclair writes this wildly successful book, makes so much money from it. He would actually later run for governor of California, but he's disappointed because the goal of his book was to convert people to socialism. Didn't work. Now, the White House was also bombarded with mail calling for reform of the industry. Theodore Roosevelt is the president when The Jungle comes out, and the book talks about the reform efforts of Roosevelt, Wilson, and a little bit by Taft, so I'll leave that to the book. But when the White House was bombarded with mail calling for reform, Roosevelt appointed a special commission to investigate Chicago's slaughterhouses. The report in May of 1906 confirmed Sinclair's experiences and claims. For example, one day, commissioners witnessed a slaughtered hog fall partway into a worker toilet. The workers took the carcass out and put it on the hook with the others on the assembly line without even cleaning the carcass that had fallen into the toilet. Now, they did this when the commissioners were around. Imagine what was going on when the commissioners weren't there. Now, previously, laws only required that animals were healthy at the time of the slaughter. Commissioners recommended inspections take place at every stage of the process. Roosevelt called the report revolting and pushed through the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which is commensurate with his character. Roosevelt acted, right? Roosevelt did not sit on the sidelines. Roosevelt did not draw lines and then not follow through on them. He acted. And so the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 authorized inspectors from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to stop any bad or mislabeled meat for commerce, thereby greatly expanding federal government regulation of private enterprise. But again, maybe this is one time when it was worth it. Now, passage of this act also opened the way for Congress to approve a law regulating sale of most food and drugs. This was called the Pure Food and Drug Act. It regulated food additives and prohibited misleading labels on food and drugs. This would also lead to the formation of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is around today. It makes sure that the food we eat is safe, that the products we use are safe. So again, this is important because it's part of this larger reform movement. Now, I mentioned Sinclair was considered a muckraker, an accidental muckraker. What was the muckraker? A muckraker was somebody who an investigative writer who uncovered truths about society. The origin comes from, simply enough, Theodore Roosevelt himself, who, while critical of a journalist one day, referred to the writer as a muckrake. But he would agree such issues needed to be made public. His quote, "There is filth on the floor and it must be scraped up with a muck rake." So again, Roosevelt recognizes that change needs to be made. Even though he's not happy about how it came about, he recognizes change needs to be made and he makes his change. Roosevelt, undoubtedly the most progressive of all the presidents at this time. Now, when we look at this, what is the biggest legacy of progressivism? I would argue it is the expanded role of the government. The federal government in the United States is now more active than it has ever been, and later movements would only work further from this. They would grab hold of this idea and use it to their own energies. One example, the New Deal. Now, the New Deal came about because of the Great Depression. Now, would Roosevelt have implemented something like that even if there was no Great Depression? He very well may have. More significantly, in the 1960s, we see the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson, and he would expand even on New Deal reforms, and the New Deal reforms expanded on progressive reforms. So we have this gradual, this evolution, this, if you will, progressive change throughout the 20th century. It starts with the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. Again, it completely changes the way the government has worked. In the past, I've talked about Jeffersonian America, I talked about Jacksonian America, and how it changed with Lincolnian America. And Lincoln helped change this. He helped to expand the powers of the federal government initially, and progressives would greatly increase this active government. But again, this is part of the overall evolution of American government throughout our nation's history. So that's enough about progressivism for now. I hope you enjoyed the discussion.